speak until about 12:45, 12:50.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay. Ready? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the Atlantic Council, to the Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East. I'm Michele Dunne. I'm from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I'm very happy to be back here with my former colleagues at the Hariri Center for what I think is going to be a fantastic discussion on getting democracy promotion right in Egypt, the new issue brief by Amy Hawthorne. Amy Hawthorne is a senior fellow here at the Rafik Hariri Center. She has a long and distinguished career, very interesting career that combines extensive study of the Middle East, extensive study of the issue of democracy and democracy promotion with actual work in the democracy promotion field in NGOs, and also time at the State Department working on these issues from a policy point of view. And to discuss the paper, we'll also have with us Dr. Shibley Telhami, who's the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, also with a very long and distinguished academic and publication record working on policy issues in the Middle East, on regional peace issues, security issues, and on public opinion and polling. So that's something I hope we'll be able to bring into the discussion. And I have to say, just looking around this room at the audience of people who are gathered for this discussion, it really reminds me of the deep regard in which Amy is held by her colleagues. I think it's a real testament to how much people respect her knowledge and have come to expect from her really original insights and new ideas. And I think this paper delivers in that regard. So I'm really looking forward to discussing it. We decided that the way we're going to conduct this is that I'm going to, in a way, interview Amy about her paper, ask her some questions about her paper, and then give the floor to Shibley to comment on it. And then we'll try to leave a generous amount of time for this very well-informed audience to ask their questions. And by the way, speaking of this audience, some of you would be very welcome to come up here. I see at least 3 or 4 empty seats at the table. So please don't be shy. Please come up here and sit next to us so you can be a fuller part of the conversation. Amy, I wanted to start by, let's start broad as we look at your paper, right? You're talking about what's going on in Egypt, the issue of democracy in Egypt and U.S. policy. So could you give us, first of all, what's the basic argument here? You stated it briefly, but I'd like you to pull it out more. How does promoting democracy in Egypt relate to core U.S. interests regarding Egypt and regarding the region, right? President Obama laid these out in his speech at the UN General Assembly, and it's been done in any other number of occasions as well. So regional peace, peace with Israel, counterterrorism, cooperation with other U.S. security or diplomatic initiatives in the region. We all know these things are high in the list of U.S. interests regarding Egypt. So what's the relationship of democracy and democracy promotion to that?
Well, first I just want to thank everyone for coming today, and thank Michele and thank Shibley for agreeing to be the respondent to my paper and in this discussion today. The issue of where democracy promotion fits in U.S. policy toward Egypt is incredibly complex and difficult. It is not a simple issue, and it's one that's really worth discussing carefully. And I'm really honored that Shibley, who's one of the most respected and well-informed and thoughtful analysts about U.S.-Egyptian relations, is here to share his wisdom with us today, because there really aren't any simple answers to this question. I think that Egypt is really a case study, almost like a pure, perfect case study of the difficulty in U.S. policy, in real U.S. policy and diplomacy, of balancing competing interests. We all know what the core security and strategic interests that the U.S. has in Egypt and has had for decades. These are long-standing interests. And we also know that promoting democracy and human rights has been an element of U.S. policy in one way or another for a long time as well, especially since 2011. In a short-term, day-to-day sense, I would say that most sort of core U.S. security interests in Egypt are not directly related to democracy, with the exception of, I would say, counterterrorism, which obviously has a lot of implications for human rights issues. I think that the way, though, that democracy is important in the U.S. relationship with Egypt is in sort of two broader ways, and one is in a longer-term sense. It's my very strongly held view that ultimately what the United States needs in order to secure its core abiding security interests in Egypt is stability in Egypt. In an unstable Egypt, the U.S. really doesn't have a reliable or a strong partner on its security and its strategic interests. And the only way that Egypt will stabilize, in my view, is if it eventually comes to be able to establish a consensus-based political system, one that reflects and upholds the pluralism that exists in the Egyptian polity and in society, and one that includes, consensus on the rules of the game among all key political players. This really, in my view, is the only way that Egypt will stabilize. A path of repression will not stabilize Egypt. And so in this sense, democracy and human rights are incredibly important for the U.S. relationship with Egypt in the short term and especially over the longer term. I think it's also important in a second respect, which is that it has to do with the kind of relationship that the U.S. is going to have with Egypt. In terms of pursuing its U.S. sort of core security and strategic interests, a lot of this is really transactional, and it doesn't always directly involve issues of democracy and human rights. But in a broader sense, I don't think that the U.S. and Egypt can really have a full relationship that goes beyond a transactional relationship, a true partnership of the kind that Egypt sometimes speaks about, the U.S. sometimes speaks about, without Egypt actually being a country that upholds democratic values and respects human rights. So those are the two ways in which I think democracy is important.
Okay, and of course, there's a big debate going on as to whether Egypt is on a path to democracy or not, and I assume that will come out in the conversation that we will have. Now, Amy, you argue in this paper that U.S. influence in Egypt is poorly understood and widely underestimated. Now, please explain what you mean by this. I mean, we've seen the United States over the last 6 months try to exert some influence, it seemed. We've seen the repeated calls from Secretary Hagel to Defense Minister Assisi, and occasionally even from President Obama or others. We've seen a partial withholding of assistance and so forth, and yet we really don't see a lot of effect of this kind of influence. I think it leads a lot of people to think, well, the United States just really doesn't have much influence in this situation. So you have some interesting things to say in the paper where you sort of pick apart the question of influence, and you talk about the distinction between what you call leverage and linkage when it comes in general to the influence of outside players over internal affairs in other countries. Could you tell us more about this regarding the United States and Egypt?
Well, the U.S. role it's stating the obvious to say that the U.S. role in Egypt is incredibly complex. And nationalism in Egypt and the idea of sovereignty and rejection of outside interference in Egyptian affairs is something that's very, very powerful in the Egyptian body politic. It has been for a long time, but it's become even more pronounced in the past few years since the 2011 uprising. And it's true that U.S. leverage in Egypt was never, under the Mubarak regime, as great as some people now say. And U.S. leverage and influence, in my view, has diminished over the past 3 years, both because of changes inside Egypt and, in my view, missteps that the U.S. has made in its policy toward Egypt during this time. However, just as we don't want to overstate U.S. influence in Egypt, we also don't want to understate it as well. And to my mind, the art of successful diplomacy is figuring out exactly what leverage and influence you may have, limited as it may be, and using that as carefully and strategically as possible. And that's where I think there is more that the U.S. can do. I think the U.S. really has two main forms of influence. Michele referred briefly to them. Potential influence, I should say. The first is leverage. And speaking very, very simply, I would say these are things that some in the Egyptian leadership and power structure want from the United States. And I think this really comes in three forms. One is U.S. weapons and military cooperation and a close military relationship with the United States. A second form of leverage is really about a certain kind of economic engagement that I think some actors in Egypt seek from the United States and from other Western countries that really is different than the support that the Gulf countries have provided to Egypt in recent months. That has been, that support has been very, very important in helping to stabilize the Egyptian economy. But the kinds of things that the United States, and it's not really the United States government, it's more the U.S. private sector, can offer to Egypt that I think are really important to help Egypt's economy thrive, not just survive, really have to do with some of our assets and things that are strong in our economy, having to do with trade and a strong private sector, technology, entrepreneurship, all of these things. This is also, in a way, a form of U.S. leverage. And the third form of U.S. leverage, I think, is the most interesting to think about, and this is quite a controversial idea, and I'm sure a lot of people won't agree with me, but I think it comes in the form of democratic legitimation of Egypt's political system. And by that I mean the United States and other Western powers, kind of giving a seal of approval or a stamp of approval to Egypt, to their government, that the path they're pursuing is a democratic one, that it's in line with broadly held international standards for democracy and human rights, and really kind of saying, yes, Egypt, you are a democracy. It may seem, very unbelievable that some people in the Egyptian government care about this, but I really believe that they do. If you just look at the efforts that are exerted by many Egyptian officials to influence U.S. thinking and Western thinking about the path that Egypt is on, and to gain our approval and our acceptance and our stamp of approval, if you will, of the roadmap and quote unquote and what's going on in Egypt. It's really, really quite remarkable. And I'll just give you one example. There are many. This is an ad that the Egyptian government, I believe, has taken out in the Times of London. And it's in English. It's toward, it's geared toward a Western audience, and it's called The Democratic Leap for Egypt. And it goes into great detail talking about how the new constitution is moving Egypt forward to a democracy and how Egypt is on a path to democracy. Not all governments make these kinds of efforts. I think that there is a segment within the Egyptian power structure that really wants to be taken seriously as a democracy and to be praised for this. So this is actually something that the U.S. has. It's a form of leverage. It's not direct. It's not that if the U.S. withholds this approval, that there will be an immediate reaction inside Cairo. Of course not. That's not how U.S.-Egyptian relations work. But over time, I believe that a more clear stance on the part of the United States and not kind of giving this quick seal of democratic approval could actually have some influence over the thinking of some influential people in Egypt. The second form of U.S. influence is what some experts have described as linkage. And this is really American soft power. It really has to do with not so much the U.S. government, but with the democratic institutions in our society and their connections and interactions with their counterparts in Egypt. This kind of linkage with Egypt and the U.S. is very, very weak for reasons that we're very well aware of. The linkage will never be between the U.S. and Egypt as strong and as rich as it is, for example, between the U.S. and Germany or the U.S. and Japan. But I still think there's a lot of room for strengthening the ties between US society and our institutions of democracy, and those in Egypt, and I believe there is a constituency among a young generation of Egyptians who are very interested in democracy, they're very interested in entrepreneurship, they're very interested in connections with the outside world. That is the constituency that the US should be targeting and trying to build links to. And it's not really about democracy promotion in a classic sense, it's really about people-to-people connections.
Okay, so it's further on the issue then of democracy promotion. So in the paper, you talk about the need for the United States to focus less on elections in Egypt and more on what you call the underlying framework for democracy and rights. So I want to ask you to make that more concrete. Egypt just held its constitutional referendum. USAID funded a robust election monitoring mission and so forth. But what about, over the next 6 to 9 months, whatever, Egypt will probably hold presidential and parliamentary elections. Now, if you were back sitting in the State Department, what would you recommend? Because elections tend to be events that grab everybody's attention and galvanize activity and so forth. There are going to be important elections taking place. How would you prioritize in whatever the U.S. does to promote democracy between doing what it can to promote free and fair elections and other things that are more like building blocks for democracy and human rights?
Well, there's no doubt that elections in Egypt are very important and that the US and other countries will focus on them. This is very typical, not just in Egypt, but all around the world. Many democracies actually often tend to have a very electoralist or electorally dominated strategy for democracy promotion. So it's not that elections in Egypt aren't important, of course they are. But I think that since 2011, since the beginning of the first Egyptian uprising, the United States has been very, very focused on each sort of successive roadmap. The roadmap that Egypt is pursuing now is not the first one. Since the beginning, there's been a series of plans and steps put forward by the Egyptian authorities, at the end of which it was hoped that somehow Egypt's democratization process would be complete. And the United States, I think, with each sort of turn of the wheel, each new process has hoped that this will finally be the one, after this election or after this constitution, things in Egypt will fall into place and Egypt will kind of be on the path to democracy. I think there are a lot of reasons why the US has had this approach. One of them is just that it's a lot simpler, it's a lot easier to kind of think about things in the frame of this path of succession of events. I don't think, though, that these events in Egypt in the past and with the upcoming elections will actually lead Egypt on a democratic path. Constitution drafting and the holding of elections in Egypt for the past 3 years has been a source ultimately of instability and polarization, not consensus building. That's one of the key factors needed for democratization. I think that the reason why the US should and Europe, by the way, should focus more on the sort of underlying human rights framework is that this is what really matters for Egyptians to be able to have space within their society to peacefully put forward alternative views, to debate the issues that are taking place in the country, to participate in whatever process is going on or not, or to provide alternatives, and also to protect the rights of individual Egyptians in a variety of ways. These things are very important. They're long-term issues. They're not going to be resolved quickly, but in my mind, this is where US attention will bring more benefit over the longer run, because without these sort of underlying protections for human rights and attention to them by the outside world, elections in Egypt, a new constitution, so on and so forth, really aren't going to be meaningful at all. And the way that I think the United States should do this is in very close cooperation with its European allies. One thing that has really perplexed me, frankly, about US policy toward Egypt is that the Obama administration, rightly so, has placed a lot of rhetorical emphasis on the value of multilateral approaches in democracy promotion, correctly so, working with our allies, working with our democratic allies, working in international fora, not making it about sort of what the US wants or says. But in reality, these efforts in Egypt have been quite quite lacking. And so I think that by working more closely with international institutions and with our European allies, we would gain more through our focus on human rights.
Okay, so one last question. To get to, you have some very specific policy recommendations toward the end of the paper, which is great. You become really pretty concrete. So I have two questions, though. One of them is, you call for withholding what you call democratic legitimization, but at the same time you call for continuing some forms of military aid. Would that be sending a mixed signal? I mean, is it, how that sounds complicated. How does the United States say that somehow what the Egyptian government is not doing legitimate, at the same time giving funding to the Egyptian government? So that's one question. And then the other question is, when you talk about continuing military aid, you talk about it in terms of updating the military aid, moving from using it to purchase big weapon systems to using it for counterterrorism or counterinsurgency tools or other things that we know have been in the discussion between the United States and Egypt. But is there a danger that if the United States does that it will actually be providing forms of assistance that, you know, the United States could later be accused of providing tools for human rights abuses?
Well, U.S. military assistance to Egypt serves our strategic goals in Egypt, which remain more or less unchanged. And so, in my view, it doesn't make sense to end our military assistance relationship with Egypt, because there's a lot of reasons for it, and that don't have anything to do with democracy, and that's the reality of our policy toward Egypt. But I also think that, you know, the U.S. interests in Egypt are complex and they're multifaceted, as I argued before, and I think that some Egyptians and some Americans can understand that U.S. policy toward Egypt isn't just about one thing or about the other. We have different interests that we're pursuing at the same time. In reality, this is not easy. This is difficult, but this is the reason in my mind why, you know, starting to look at how to restructure certain aspects of our military aid relationship with Egypt are probably the more appropriate and realistic first step. And in that regard, we already know that Egypt's security needs and the kinds of threats, security threats that Egypt is facing today have changed and are really in some ways not in sync with our military aid program. So I do think that there's room there to start to try to make some changes in the kind of assistance that we provide, or build on changes that have already started. And indeed, some in the Egyptian military have also expressed support for this kind of approach. I think we also should look at, you know, the way, not just what we're providing to Egypt in military aid, but the way that we're providing it. There's some special perks that we've been giving to Egypt for a long time that we give to very few other countries. And maybe it's time to look at those and really say, you know, do we want to continue these special perks? Does this really serve the whole of our relationship or not? In terms of your last question, which is a very difficult one, this is a real diplomatic challenge for the United States, because the U.S., in pursuing closer, you know, cooperation with Egypt on some security threats, will have to diplomatically draw a contrast to its Egyptian counterparts about the kinds of security threats that the U.S. views as the most important and legitimate, and what the United States doesn't view as a security threat. Peaceful political participation, for example, versus terrorism that's emanating in the Sinai. That's a real diplomatic challenge. I think the U.S. can do it, but I don't think it's easy. I would just add in closing that I think also Congress has a role to play here as well. There are a number of provisions in U.S. law that have to do with human rights concerns in military aid, Leahy vetting process and things like that have not always been, you know, robustly applied with regard to Egypt, but they're instruments that do exist that would allow the United States to pursue our security relationship with Egypt while also having some of these human rights concerns built into the policy as well. And that's, in my view, Congress really needs to play that role.
Okay, thank you, Amy. So I want to turn to Shibley now. Shibley, I want to give you a few minutes to give your general reactions to the paper, the ideas in it, and I hope you will bring out a little bit, as I said, the broader policy perspective, the regional peace and stability part of U.S. interests, and also the very hot issue of public opinion in Egypt. How do you read it? And public opinion in Egypt about the current political situation and also about the United States.
Great. Well, thanks. First of all, thanks for hosting me. This is the first time I'm in the new headquarters of the Atlantic Council. Very impressive. And it's really a pleasure to be with you, Michele, and with Amy, two scholars I highly admire and respect. I think when you look at the Egyptian situation, like anything that's unfolding in the Arab world right now, many of us have divided tendencies. And the division that reflects itself both in the discourse and in government position is driven by two things. One thing is the obvious, which is sort of we're torn between the moral and the strategic, as always. And I think most of us want the moral and the value issue to be part of our foreign policy. I certainly do. And there are things that we obviously don't like, and things that we see as violations of human rights that we have to make a stand on. And yet we have these major strategic interests that we identify that don't always go with them. So we always struggle with that. But even worse in this case of a fluid strategic environment is that we don't even know what the strategic interests are because they are moving. And so in some ways, when you look at what happened in Egypt, after the overthrow of Morsi, the confrontation of Rabaa, or any of the things that have happened, we're all conflicted because there are times when I say, "Forget it," we should make a stand. Or sometimes I say, "Are we really wedded to those same strategic interests that were defined prior? Are they still hold?" And there are people I respect who take different positions on this. Pull out and strategic interests are not important. And so I'd like to tell you how I tilt on this debate and why, and in some ways directly relate to Amy's paper, because I think Amy's paper is very strong. It makes a consistent and clear argument and very thoughtful. And she chose to make her argument not on the moral grounds, but on interest grounds. If you recall, she essentially makes three arguments. One is that democracy is an American interest, at least in the long term. Two, that the U.S. has a degree of influence that is underutilized in the events in Egypt. And finally, that she puts forth a package of recommendations that she thinks is going to move in that direction. And there are also sub-hypotheses, particularly about the role of the military, which is our core institutional ally in Egypt, that there is inherently incapable of democratic reform, or they're inherently undemocratic. So I'd like to address that argument broadly speaking. Let me start with democracy is in our interest. I actually happen to agree with that. So I don't have a problem with that. I know that some people do, but I happen to think that even aside from the moral question, I happen to agree with that argument that ultimately a democratic Egypt is more stable and more in harmony with what we want to achieve in the Middle East. Some people disagree with it. But the real question for me, particularly when you are advising a president or secretary of state, it's not enough to say something is an American interest. What you have to identify is two things, is how it fits in your other strategic priorities that are bigger interest in the short term. And number two, what policy you're advocating, particularly if it includes elevating the issue in the priorities, you have to have a degree of confidence that it's gonna get you where you want to get. And those two are big, big items, and I'm going to address those two. The first one is the location of that, quote, interest of a democratic Egypt in America's priority. Let's assume that we're even capable of taking some actions that would move Egypt in that direction. I don't think anyone envisions that that's likely to happen the next 3 years on the clock of this administration. You can start a process, but no one I know, some people argue it might take decades, but I don't think anyone would argue it's going to happen next year or the year after. So in the short term, the U.S. is dealing with immediate strategic priorities. Some of them propelled themselves on the agenda, some of them by choice. The American forces are still in the Middle East. And they are not going anywhere in the foreseeable future. Maybe we can start reassessing for down the road, but it's not going to happen on this president's clock. You have to deal with that. That's a priority that every American president can have to deal with. We're still engaged in an ongoing war with Al-Qaeda affiliates all over the Middle East. That's still an American priority. It's not going anywhere. If anything, it's getting more problematic. And third, the Syria crisis, which is bloody and tragic, propelled itself on the agenda in a way that the US has to figure out a diplomatic way out of it, engage on it. On top of that, the president himself has said that his two biggest strategic priorities in the Middle East in the short term are the Iranian nuclear issue and the Israel-Palestine negotiations. And frankly, if I were to advise him, I would say those are the issues you should focus on for a variety of reasons. Put aside the Israel-Palestine question. But whatever you say about Egypt, whether we intervene or not, whether it's democratic or not in the next 3 years, it is unlikely that whatever going to happen in Egypt is going to drag us into a war in the Middle East. If we fail in our diplomatic effort to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons diplomatically, the pressure on this president to engage in war before he leaves office is going to be tremendous. If there's one issue that could drag the United States into war in the Middle East right now, it's the Iran issue, is in case of diplomatic failure. So the president is right for making that a top priority for him. It's the only issue that could drag America into a war that it doesn't want. And that has consequences. The consequences are not only in terms of interest, because it reshuffles everything else, and you need allies, and you forget about democracy the minute you are in war, as happened in 1991 or 2003. All of those agendas disappear, completely reshuffled. You can't do anything that you want to do because you need allies for that. But also morally. I mean, you know, even if you win a war, you can see the horrific moral consequences of any war. Look at what happened in Iraq, whatever you look at it, and what the consequences are in comparison to any abuses of democracy in any particular country. So even morally, you can make an argument that it's the right priority for a president to do. So once you start with those issues, that we have a set of priorities that are full agenda, then you look around and you say, how am I going to get this agenda? Whether or not the president succeeds on the Israel-Palestine question, on the Iran question, on the Syria question, the United States is going to need tremendous coordination with other regional allies to make any of them succeed in case of success or in case of failure. If you fail, you're going to have to pick up the pieces. You need allies. And you look at a fluid environment in the Middle East, the context of which you really don't know where the anchors are. They're principally right now, to this day, really two big parties still in play in the Arab world that have influence even in their messy situation. And that is Saudi Arabia, with all its limits and all our reservations about their democratic issues at home. They're still ones that have capacity to influence events. And Egypt, mostly the Egyptian military. In part, imagine what would happen on the Israel-Palestine question. The Gaza issue, particularly, where the Egyptians have tremendous influence, one way or the other, to make it succeed or to make it fail. So if I'm looking at it from that perspective, I don't see this as a short-term priority for me strategically. I can't make that argument at all. In fact, I can see it in some ways working against me. I need to build alliances preparing for either success or failure of these issues. The second point I want to make has to do with the limits of what we do. I happen to also agree with Amy that on the margins, we certainly have the capacity to influence events, and maybe we can do more and can do better on some of those issues. But I have no confidence at all in our ability to get the right outcome in Egypt or elsewhere. I have no confidence. And I don't believe that if I were the president, I could do it, or if anyone else I admire was the president can do it. And I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and say the president should be doing this, or the secretary of state be doing this. But look at what we've done. We've invested so much resources in Iraq, trillions of dollars, thousands of lives. Look at the mess we have. In Syria, we had less investment, but look at the mess we have. In Libya, we had some in-between intervention. Look at the mess we have. To think that on the margins, through something that we can do here and there, somehow we're going to end up with the right results, I think is wishful thinking. I think we can prevent things from happening, but we can't make the right things happen. I think we have to keep a sense of realism about the outcomes. I know you told me I have 2 more minutes, but I want to make just 2 quick final points. One about the Egyptian military. Of course, the Egyptian military is driven by its institutional interests. They want to keep maximum power. They're going to protect their empire. They're going to protect their economic interests. I don't think their instincts are democratic at all. They're a bureaucracy. They want to protect their interests like everyone else in a changing environment. And they want to, but if you look, the real question is not whether they have interests to protect. The real question is, do they understand that they have a fluid environment in the context of which they have to adjust their interests? And if you look at what happened, the responsiveness has been principally to the read of the Egyptian public, because they understand there's an element out there. Yes, they'd like to manipulate it in some ways for their own interests, and they try. But if you look at what happened, I mean, initially, in our own country, there was a debate. Will they dump Mubarak? Well, they did. Will they allow a Muslim Brotherhood presidential candidate to? Well, they did. But the thing, and then they did overthrow him, but one can't ignore the fact that they overthrew him only when they were confident they have significant public support for that. And I think that they understand there's a fluid environment. So the pressure on them, the most important pressure on them, isn't mostly coming from us and the international community. They're responsive to us, and I think we should use that. But I think by and large, it's the pressure that's coming from the own public. And I think if they think that they can crush the Brotherhood, the numbers show they can't. They have a core support that is going to be there. And if they think they can rush both the Brotherhood and the liberals, they're in for surprises whatever we do, whether we support them or oppose them. The Tahrir Square is going to be full again, and Sisi will face the same fate as Morsi. And the same fate as Mubarak if he is not responsive. So the real change in Egypt is really the public, not us. Now, with the specific recommendations, I happen to agree, of course, with people to people and all that as a long-term investment. That's absolutely true. I also think, aside from the strategic interests, we need to take moral positions. I do think we should continue to condemn whenever there's violations of human rights. As a matter of principle, I don't care about the consequences in some issues on the margins, but it's a position, a posture that we should take. But if you ask the president, as you suggest, to elevate that and his rhetoric on this issue as a high-profile position, that I have questions about. The question is, when you have a president that highlights an issue and makes it a priority, then he's measured by what he says. And if he's not prepared to follow up, which he's not because of what I said, then he is going to be criticized. And it's not going to be enough for anybody in Egypt who's liberal because they think we're not doing enough. And so it'll be more of a failure and a success. Why would he want to do that? By refraining from highlighting it, the most he's going to alienate are people like us who follow this. The general American public isn't paying attention. The general international opinion public isn't paying attention. But the minute he makes it a priority issue, everybody pays attention. He pays a price. So I think we need to differentiate between a consistent position at some level of government on those issues from the president taking this issue as a priority issue for himself.
Okay, great. Amy, in a minute, I'm just going to give you a very quick, I'd like to give you a quick moment to respond, particularly to this issue of U.S. priorities, right? I mean, that seems to be, you were objecting much less to Amy's argument and what she was then to, than you were to how high this should be in U.S. priorities,
the priorities and our ability to do
how much we can. I'm going to give you a moment to respond to that. And please start preparing your questions. I'm going to open the floor in just a moment. But I do want to ask you just one quick follow-up. You mentioned, Shibley, in passing, the ongoing struggle with Al-Qaeda and terrorism. And I do think that has been a very high priority for the administration. Even though maybe a couple of years ago, with the death of bin Laden and the political changes in the region, there was a feeling that Al-Qaeda and such extremists were really on the retreat now. They seem to be resurgent, partly due to Syria and developments in North Africa and so forth. So here's my specific question. If we assume that counterterrorism and fighting against Al-Qaeda continue to be a strong strategic priority for the United States in dealing with this region, how do you see what has happened in Egypt with the removal of Morsi, with the crackdown on the Brotherhood? How does this affect the possibility of, of the jihadi extremism and Al-Qaeda in the region generally, in Egypt, and how does this affect U.S. counterterrorism interests?
Yes, I think that an attempt to crush Islamists completely and deny them a voice will push toward militancy. And I think it is dangerous for the U.S. down the road. I think it's dangerous for Egypt. And I think that I would expect, though, while we will see elements of that probably if they continue, even before we see that, we're going to see more public outrage in Egypt. And that is going to be consequential for the way they structure their policy and government. So I'm actually more, in some ways, I'm more of a believer in the empowerment of the public in the Arab uprisings. That I do think that people's voices will not be denied, and I think that while you can repress people for a short time, I just don't think that if you look at the coalition of people who supported the military in the overthrow of Morsi. And they were, of all sorts, including liberals, some of whom are now on the defensive. So I really don't think, I see it as a problem, and it's something that the U.S. has to be mindful of and balancing. I don't see it as the immediate problem for the U.S.
Okay, thank you. So Amy, just a very short, really just a minute or two response so we can then open it up.
On the question of prioritization, I very much agree with the way Shibley described the prioritization of current U.S. interests in the Middle East. I think that's accurate, although I would wish maybe in some ways it were slightly different. I think it's accurate. But to my mind, there are really two questions that we have to think about with regard to Egypt and this prioritization of Iran and peace process and Syria. The first one is, in working with Egypt, the Egyptian government, to advance those interests, does the United States need to give a democratic endorsement to this Egyptian government to do so? Do we need to bite our tongue about our concerns about human rights abuses and democratic reversal in order to pursue those interests? I don't think so. And I also think that, the U.S. has been working closely with Egypt for decades, and there is sort of a broad alignment. Egypt, in many ways, agrees with us on these goals. I don't think we have to coddle Egypt or to sugarcoat our criticism or to avoid saying what we think about their internal politics in order to work with them on these interests. So those are the things that I think are important. And in one other respect, I think Egypt is not an immediate priority in the way you described. And what's happening in Egypt, whether it moves in a democratic direction or a direction of repression and ongoing instability, is going to take years to play out. But I would argue that if the U.S. doesn't attend in a consistent and sustained manner to what's going on in Egypt's internal politics, Egypt actually could become a much bigger and much more difficult problem for the U.S. in a few years that would affect the entire strategic environment in which we're trying to pursue these goals. So the idea, not that you made, but the argument that some have made that we just sort of put Egypt on the shelf, I don't think serves U.S. interests in the medium run.
Okay, thank you, Amy. So questions from the audience, please just put up your hand if, Greg.
Discussion. My question for Amy is that I'd like to pull you out a little bit on the polarization right now in Egyptian society and how U.S. democracy promotion programs or policies are being received. Because on the one hand, the Muslim Brotherhood people believe that we gave the Egyptian military green light to crack down. We may see objectively that doesn't make sense, but that's widely held. And then many of the liberals in Egypt sided with the military because they made a calculated decision. They'd rather have a temporary military regime than a Muslim Brotherhood regime. So where is the constituency right now for people to receive U.S. democracy policies, given this highly polarized environment? Thank you.
Yeah, let's go initially. We can
Okay.
go ahead.
That's a great question. The environment in which the U.S. would be pursuing these policies, as you said, is incredibly polarized, and there's a huge amount of hostility to the United States and Egypt. It's been there for a long time, and it's gotten much worse in the past few years for a variety of reasons. But I think that Egyptian public opinion is a lot more complex than it appears on the surface. Certainly, there are large numbers of Egyptians who will reject what the United States says or does, no matter what. But I also think that there is a segment of Egyptians, especially among younger Egyptians, who are very interested in a democratic future for their country. And there is a generational shift there, by the way. I think there's a very significant generational change with these younger Egyptians and their attitudes that really is looking for the United States to stand up for what it says it believes in and to stand up for and act on behalf of our values. Now, how does the U.S. break through in this environment? It's not easy. It doesn't come with one speech or with one action. It has to be part of a long-term effort. And I think that the U.S. has made it even harder for itself by having a rhetoric that has been very confusing and very inconsistent, with very strong proclamations of support for democracy and human rights, and then a pulling back. It's sort of been like a roller coaster ride in terms of rhetoric. So I think the U.S. would be better served in Egypt to have a message that's maybe more realistic and more consistent. As one very wise observer of Egyptian politics said to some of us who were discussing this issue with her, the U.S. has a lot of strength and power and influence in its consistency. When it pursues and talks about an issue consistently, that gives us influence, and that is something where I think we could do a lot better.
Okay, please do identify yourself.
My name is Sam Al-Kitbi. I am from United Arab Emirates. I'm chairwoman of Emirates Policy Center and also a professor of political sciences. I'm also studied in Egypt and lived in Egypt, and I love Egypt. I just want to ask, Amy, what does actually United States has a strategy towards Egypt or towards the whole region? And the other question, why do the American believes that what's good for United States is good for the Arab region or for the Arab world? And the other things, also, whatever you put money, efforts, still you did not get the public support, the Arab public support, or why US failed to get this support or love. And I believe in your recommendation, because I know, and I went to Egypt many times after revolution, the first priority for the Egyptian is the economy, to get job. They don't care for democracy because there is no cultural democratic values and norms still there. Where you want to work, if this is my recommendation for the United States, keep a low profile. Work on the education, how to educate. I mean, people, whoever will come, either military or Muslim Brotherhood or liberals, they lack the democratic culture. So it will end with exclusion for everybody from the political process. I think education is also, if you can put there, you will help the Egyptian and economy. Thank you.
Okay, actually, I'm going to give the floor to Shibley first to talk a little bit about the issue of Egyptian opinion about the United States and so forth.
Yeah, and I think this is really kind of central in a way in terms of how people will read our actions when we intervene, even for humanitarian reasons. And I think there is a sense, obviously, that maybe what we do will be welcomed or interpreted by some quarters. And I think sometimes we don't differentiate. When people are in conflict, and I'm involved in a domestic conflict, whether it's in Syria or Iraq or Egypt or anywhere else, and the U.S. is a superpower with enormous resources, and I want to win against whoever it is, my opponent, I'm going to ask anybody who can help me to help me, and including the U.S. And so in that sense, it's not about a public opinion, it's about a strategic selection of alliances for aid to win a local conflict. That doesn't translate into public opinion. And what we see in the Arab world is that, particularly in Egypt, is that the source of attitudes toward the U.S. isn't anything in the short term. Whatever we do, even when we do it for humanitarian reason, will be seen to be for nefarious reasons, will be seen to be just to advance American imperial interests. Everything that we do. And you know, doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Now, that's a different story, because something you need to do for moral reasons, something you need to do for your interests, something you need to do for, you know, principle. So it's not an argument against doing something, but if your aim is to win public opinion, I think that is not going to happen in the short term. That's why no matter what we do in the short term, and the administration hasn't handled itself too badly, you can argue on the margins, you're going to get criticized by the right and the left, by the Muslim Brotherhood and by the military and by the liberals. And you're going to continue to do that because no option is going to be satisfactory enough to them. These attitudes toward the U.S. based on mistrust of America's intention, that's a function of decades of policy principally linked to big item, ticket item issues like the Israel-Palestine question and the Gulf. And so I think that whatever we aim, it shouldn't be in the short term as we are implementing strategic interest on the hope of winning mass public support in Egypt. It's not going to happen.
Okay, Amy, can you speak now to the issue of U.S. strategy, and Ibtisam is recommending a low-key, low-profile strategy, just help on education and so forth. What do you think about that?
Well, those are great questions. On the question of strategy toward Egypt, I think the main U.S. strategic goal with regard to Egypt for the past 3 years has been very simple. It's been to maintain a relationship with whoever is in power in Egypt throughout all this turbulence and this turmoil that we've seen. And that's very understandable why that's been the case, why that has been our overriding goal. And then the U.S. has had other goals as well. The U.S. is not opposed to democracy in Egypt. Indeed, I think this administration would actually welcome that development. The question has really been what the administration has been willing to do to advance that goal. In terms of, you talked about the economy and the importance of the economy to Egyptians. I completely agree. I do not think we can underestimate how important that issue is in terms of Egyptians' expectations and political life in Egypt, and indeed the country's stability. There's a huge risk of instability in Egypt if the economy doesn't improve. But I also think that there's a link between economic development and democratization of Egypt, in the sense that the kinds of economic reforms that Egypt really needs to make that are going to be very difficult and very painful can only really be carried out, I think, by leadership that has some legitimacy, some popular support. And I also think that the old bargain that a lot of Egyptians accepted in the past, that they would be willing to accept certain kind of economic policies or support from the state in return for suppressing their demands for democracy, that's over. That's not going to work anymore. The social contract is really broken, and I think a lot of Egyptians, I think, won't accept waiting for economic improvement while having their rights suppressed. So both issues are very important, and I don't think we can just give our attention to the economy without looking at the bigger political context in which economic development might take place.
Okay, Nancy.
Hi, Nancy O'Kale from Tahrir Institute. Thank you so much for this rich discussion. I see that we always put in our talks the rhetoric of the people-to-people engagement. But when we come to actual policy recommendations or policy engagement, it is still trapped within the government-to-government engagement. And that's because it's also easier to measure and easier to see tangible steps towards a roadmap, procedural democracy in general, and we see it's a series of elections or steps to be taken. But unfortunately, not just because this is ignoring the people in practice. I mean, let's set the moral issue on the side, but again, talking about interest and talking about tangible gains, we've seen throughout, if we've learned anything over the past 3 years, that elections, no matter how the high turnout is there, no matter how overwhelming the acceptance is, they can be overturned, and they can be overturned overnight. And this shows the vulnerability of procedural democracy in that sense. But at the same time, I don't see when we talk about people-to-people or government-to-people engagement, I don't see this translated into policy. And one last thing, so my question is like, how can we translate that into, operationalize this into practice? And the second thing is that it is, I mean, it's very difficult to see that we are still being trapped in the same issues, in the same talk, without actually having an actual plan or strategy to do that. Policymakers, yes, they think about politics, but at the end of the day, they are bureaucracies. Governments are bureaucracies, and it takes a long time for them to change the plan, the strategy, and translate it into resources. And by the time they reach that, the situation on the ground will have changed already. So how do we keep with that volatility and that change and the innovation and the creativity of the people on the ground? Thank you.
I actually would like to take the next question, which, because it's from Laith Kuba of the NED, who knows a lot about people-to-people exchanges and so forth. So just to see if you have anything you want to add on that point, Laith, and then ask whatever it is you would like to add.
Well, I'll go straight to the question, if I may. I mean, thank you for raising critical points. I am going to make 2 or 3 assumptions and then probe a point. I understand that I think we see that the US is resistant and reluctant to do more on Egypt for reasons obviously you've highlighted. And I think also it's obvious that Egypt is going through a difficult time. It needs help. So far, the changes are not going that well. And I think what is still emerging, although the army is remaining central in power, but the governance system that Egypt has is not clear. Now, some might argue things will get better. Some might argue things will get worse. My question is, I see Egypt heading towards serious problems and self-harm. And at what point, if Egypt continues in, let's say, in its self-harm, or it breaks down, some more aspects of a breaking down takes place, gross violations of human rights, or what have you, at what point do you think the US would see that irrespective of its discomfort, it just has to intervene in helping Egypt help shape a governance system beyond, as I said, simply preserving the army, because that is what the struggle. What we had in the past, the Mubarak model, it has the NDP, it has the economic elite around him. It was semi-military at the background, the military, but now that model has failed and it's gone. And it's not very clear what model ahead, but what is clear is Egypt needs help in shaping up its model. So my point, at what point do you think, irrespective of the discomfort, the US would move and it becomes critical for that intervention?
Okay, so we have 2 questions here. One about how to translate the call for more people-to-people contact into how to operationalize it into policy, with the tendency always being to favor more straightforward government-to-government exchanges, and then also this issue, which I think, Laith, you've sort of brought together in a way, the democracy and the stability issue here. You're saying, well, what if the United States has to, in effect, get more involved in order to preserve Egypt from actions that might be undermining its own stability. So would you like to begin, Amy?
Sure. In terms of strengthening people-to-people engagement, I just want to say at the outset that I'm not under any illusions that this is sort of a silver bullet to help strengthen democracy in Egypt. It's a very long-term, indirect, and very soft tool, and it's not something that would reap benefits anytime soon. And in addition to that, there are a lot of structural obstacles in the relationship between the US and Egypt that make this kind of relationship difficult. But I still think that there's much more that the US can do, and really utilize our own soft power. As I said before, it is a mystery to me why we are not taking better advantage of the things and elements in our society, not that our government is doing, but that are in Egyptian society that I think a lot of Egyptians actually really admire and would like to have more interaction with. This has to do with our higher education system, our private sector, and so forth. How do we do this? It's actually something in which the role of the U.S. government is, as such, is fairly limited. It really has to happen between the two societies, and in a way, it's something very organic. It sort of comes up from below. I think, though, the U.S. government can play a role by signaling that this is something important, by indicating that it's a priority, by mobilizing those inside the United States, including within the Egyptian diaspora, and other actors in the United States who would be interested in expanding ties with Egypt, by mobilizing and catalyzing those kinds of efforts, by doing things to make it easier for Egyptians to visit the United States and so forth. So I think there are a number of steps that the U.S. government as such could take to at least plant the seeds for a stronger relationship between the U.S.
Amy,
people down the road.
I want to sort of pin you down on this a little bit. So, for example, if you're talking about economic connections and connections between the private sector and everything, obviously one thing the United States conceivably could do is to facilitate some contacts through a free trade agreement or free trade arrangements of some kind or so forth. So, but again, how does that fit in? Would you support that now, even if the United States, for example, is concerned about the actions of the Egyptian government regarding human rights and political openness and so forth? Would it still be a good idea to, at this point, go forward with a free trade agenda in order to facilitate that kind of contact?
That's a good question. I would see a potential free trade agreement as something a little bit different than what I was talking about, because it really is something that the U.S. government would do. It would require policy steps and changes by the U.S. government as such. For a variety of reasons, I don't think it's the appropriate time for the United States to pursue that with Egypt. But I do think the U.S. could make it clear that down the road, this is something that we might be able to look at. And there are things that we can do to build the constituency or support those inside Egypt who are very interested in that goal and help them think about the kinds of reforms and policy changes that they would need to make down the road in order to put Egypt in a better position eventually to be in a place to pursue such an agreement. So that's really indirect, and it has to do with private sector exchanges and education and professional exchanges and things like that. So in terms of an FTA, no, I don't believe the U.S. should pursue that at this time. I don't think it would be the right time or send the right message.
Let me turn to Shibley maybe to look more at Laith's question. Now, so Egypt is already now in a situation where there are domestic terrorist attacks. I mean, there was one today, I think, and it's become unfortunately a weekly, if not more frequent reality in Egypt, that suicide bombings and so forth. So, does the United States need to be concerned that Egypt is heading down what Laith called a road of self-harm, or what is your view about this?
The U.S. I think is concerned, and there is reason to be concerned. But I think if you're looking at it, particularly from Laith's question point of view, which is at what point do you say I need to change policy? You can have a look at it on both ends: the moral question and the national interest question. The moral question itself is relevant. I mean, I think that the American national security bureaucracies, the CIA, the military state, certainly their instinct is to consolidate and maintain the relationship with the military because they see them as helpful, and they were not inclined to want to cut aid to Egypt. And I think the president's instinct probably wasn't there either because of these constituencies. But I think the scale of death in Rabaa was something that they couldn't ignore. And I don't think it was a strategic decision which says, if I cut off aid, they're going to stop. I don't think that was at all the case. I think it was more of a stand that says, I can't tolerate this, and this is just, I can't do nothing in the face of this scale, right? So I think if there is a scale like that or larger, it's going to put any president or any government under difficult attack. I mean, we do have elites here while they're not determining of congressional politics, who care about moral and human rights issues. And I think, yes, I mean, at some point, probably it could become a bigger issue. But on the national security issues, I think the U.S. is in a mood, which I don't think is an incorrect place to be, that we're not the principal agent of change in the Middle East, that the minute we have too big a footprint in a place that's evolving, we become the focal point in a way that brings about an outcome not to our liking. And therefore, even when we mean well, where we end up is not where we want to be, and therefore avoid that to the extent you can. So I think there may be change of policy, there may be redefinition of priorities vis-a-vis Egypt, there may be redefinition of interest on the margins, but I do not see a set of circumstances in any foreseeable future that are realistic that would entail a bigger American involvement in Egypt.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, and I know as a moderator that somehow magically the minutes at the end of the hour go much more quickly than those at the beginning. So I have a couple of questions teed up right now, and then if you want to ask a question before the end of the session, please let me know now. Ode Abourudaina, and then Rafi Danziger.
When we talk about democracy in the Middle East, first we have to realize it takes a long time. It's a long process. I think what people in the region want first is judicial reform. I mean, that's where you start. People in the region want to see the abuse of power and special privilege swept away. So I think this emphasis on democracy, 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 democracy does not take into account the social fabric of the region, doesn't take into account traditions, and if we want to promote human rights, I think it begins with the rule of law.
Okay, we'll take, I think we're going to take a couple more questions, and then Rafi?
Rafi Danziger, an advisor to AIPAC. I haven't had yet the pleasure of reading your paper, Amy. I don't know if you discussed that, but I think that one of the most important components of regional stability is the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. And I think it's very, very important that the military is totally committed to maintaining that peace treaty. It was not necessarily the case with the Muslim Brothers, who had a very different attitude toward the peace treaty. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, of whether this is also a critical American interest to maintain the peace treaty and therefore maintain the relationship with the military.
Okay, thank you. This gentleman here?
Thank you. Mahfouz Tadros, former World Bank staff. First of all, I would like to re-emphasize the point that our sister from the United Arab Emirates have made about the economy, about the need to create employment for the youth in Egypt. This is a key question. You have all agreed that democracy is a long-term process. So it will take time for Egypt to reach the democratic values that the United States preaches. And democracy, as you know, should also be homegrown. My question to you is as follows. When would you recommend that the United States reprogram part of its military aid to economic aid to create the employment that's needed for the Egyptian youth? Thank you.
Okay, we just have two last questions. The lady in the back there?
Okay, Diane Perlman, George Mason School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. I think you can't have a true representative democracy unless you have instant runoff voting. And the fact that I think a lot of the reform vote in Egypt got divided among candidates, that they got left with Morsi and Mubarak's, they got left with two bad choices. And then we look at them and say, look, they had democracy and look who they chose. And in Iran, for example, a few days before the election, the reform candidate pulled out and threw his votes to Rouhani, so they could have had somebody more extremist. And even in the United States, we have had issues with that you always have a spoiler effect. So, counterfactual, if they could have had another candidate that could have had more stability. So what happened was not necessarily inevitable. So could someone speak to that?
Okay, thank you. And then Mohammed Menshawi, last question right there, please. Thank you.
Mohammed Menshawi. I'm Egyptian, so I just would like to respond to the professor from United Arab Emirates. I agree, economy is important and unemployment is important, of course, but not only in Egypt, that's everywhere. Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, United States, of course, the economy is important. But I disagree totally with you about Egyptian people are not ready for democracy. They are ready, but Egyptian military and previous regime element are not ready for democracy, and that our experience showed in the last 7 months. My question is for the panel is, what United States is going to do with Egyptian interim government classification of the Brotherhood as terrorist organization? How they will deal with this problem?
Okay, so I'm going to give each of the speakers a few minutes. I'm going to come to you first, Shibley, to give Amy, our author, the last word. So we've got a bunch of issues on the table here. I mean, one thing I think that's interesting is these issues that have been raised, like the economy and rule of law. What is the relationship between these things and democracy, political contestation, and so forth? That's one question. The peace treaty with Israel, where should that be in U.S. priorities? The issue of the electoral systems and sort of the technicalities and whether they can have a profound effect on outcomes, and then the classification of the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. So you can choose some of those to comment on, Shibley.
Let me take two broad issues. I'll start with the one that Rafik started with about the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, where the military and the Muslim Brotherhood are. I think that whatever we say about Mubarak, Morsi, the post-Morsi regime in Egypt, the military has been the dominant player throughout the entire process. It's not like suddenly we have the military. I mean, the military has been dominant, including in Morsi's period. And I can give you another prediction. The military in Egypt will be still one of the most, if not the most important institution in Egypt 10 years from now. Okay, so we're not really talking about military versus no military. And Morsi didn't challenge the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. His public opinion even didn't challenge it. And in part, yes, it was the military, but that's because even Morsi thought that he has to put up with the military to the extent that he had a plan to bring him more, under control of a civilian state. It was a long-term plan, maybe 10 years and more, if he were lucky. So the reality of it is we have the military in Egypt. So the question isn't about whether we have it or not. The question is, are they prepared to accommodate themselves to changes in society that are more encompassing? And I think that's really what we're talking about. And I think, therefore, I don't see a threat to the Israel-Egypt treaty if you have more reform in Egypt. I just don't. I just see this as an evolving strategic situation. So it really, we have to understand this about the military. I mean, I think, and military is important not only because it's the most powerful institution, and of course it controls so much of the economy, but there's so many constituents directly. Egyptians participate in the military. They control such a big chunk of the economy that employs so many people who are directly invested. Egypt's sense of self envisions a big military. The people terrified about the collapse of the states in Iraq and elsewhere, they see the military as the anchor of the state, even if they have divisions. So I don't think that, even if they might want to change Morsi or change somebody else, I don't think the institution is going to disappear, or that it's going to allow itself, or the people are going to allow themselves to disappear. It's something with us to stay we have to deal with. And therefore, there will be continuity in Egyptian foreign policy on strategic issues, because the military will be given deference on issues related to, particularly to the Israel question. On the economic and military aid, I think we really forget. I mean, there are two issues. One issue is this what Egypt needs? Yes, of course. I mean, employment is great. This is what Egypt needs. But even when you have that kind of package of aid, it is not likely to transform the economy in any foreseeable future. It is impossible, if we're talking about, again, for an Obama administration agenda in the next 3 years, look at the billions that are pouring in from the Gulf states, and obviously they're just patchwork in terms of dealing with immediate urgent thing, and they're incapable of transforming the economies. But in the American side of providing aid, I think there's politics involved with aid. The military aid has an American vested interest of multinational corporations who obviously mostly get the money for providing the services, the equipment that are part of this package of the aid. And you take it away from them, that's a problem. And aid for Egypt has never been for democratic reasons per se. It was always strategic in nature, and it's much easier to make the argument with Congress on strategic aid than pure economic aid. So I don't think the possibilities are huge, and certainly given the military's resistance in Egypt for them, I don't see that as the big avenue. It's a factor, but it's not a big avenue of economic transformation in Egypt.
What, if anything, should the United States say or do about the classification or the calling of the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization in Egypt?
I have a big problem with that. I do, and I think it's problematic. I think they made a mistake, and I think the U.S. Obviously, part of it is one of the things that have happened is that we're paying for the price of this fashion of calling everybody we don't like terrorists back in the Bush administration. And it's odd that it's being used against us now. So everybody is naming their enemies and political opponent as terrorists, whether it's in Syria or in Bahrain or in Egypt, and it's fallen into fashion. And at a time when our own public has come to reject it and see it as an instrument for diverting attention. I think the Egyptians are doing it mostly for regional reasons. I have to tell you what, and it's not just domestic. I mean, part of the reason is that they fear that some of the Muslim Brotherhood is going to reorganize elsewhere outside Egypt. And they have agreements in the context of the Arab League where no organization classified as terrorist by one state will be allowed presence in another state. So I think they're doing it in large part for that reason. I don't think they have an illusion that the Muslim Brotherhood is just the few people they're arresting or they're prohibiting. I think even within the regime, just my most recent trip to Egypt, well, just right after you were there, the people are saying it, from within the regime, that if there were parliamentary elections, they'll probably win. The Brotherhood would probably win between 20 to 25% of the seats, even in this environment. So I don't think they have, any illusions about putting them away or classifying a quarter of Egyptians who, electorate as terrorists. So I think it's tactical, but I think it's problematic, and I think the U.S. is going to have a problem with it.
Okay, thank you. Amy, the last few minutes for you to comment on whichever of these issues you would like.
These are all excellent questions. I'll just pick one to respond to in the interest of time, and it's what Ode said. Yes, of course, democracy takes a long time, and that's why in my paper I've tried to outline a strategy that would actually orient the United States more toward a long-term effort in Egypt, because if democratization ever succeeds in Egypt, it's going to be only through a very long and painful and difficult process. Yes, I also agree with you that people in Egypt and elsewhere in the region want judicial reform. They want an end to the abuse of power. They want accountability. They want dignity. They want to live as citizens with dignity. I don't understand how you get those things in Egypt without democratic processes, institutions, and values. There just isn't any other way to achieve those goals other than through democracy. Now, what form that takes, what kinds of institutions Egyptians decide they want to set up, if they choose to do so, to protect those rights and advance those goals, is completely up to Egyptians. How they structure a democracy, if that's the direction they want to go in. The role of the United States, I think, is to reinforce and hold Egypt to the standards that it has set for itself. And this is why I think that a focus on human rights actually might be a more successful strategy, because the design of institutions and the form of democracy, that's not the business of the United States or any outside power. That's up to Egyptians. But the Egyptian government has made a number of important international human rights commitments. And the government of Egypt says that it wants to be taken seriously as a rights-upholding member of the international community. And indeed, in its new constitution, it enshrines or upholds these international instruments to which it is signed on to. So that's why I think the United States would do better to focus on these international standards that Egypt has presumably agreed to, And then leave sort of the design and the structure, of course, to Egyptians themselves to really hash out and figure out. So.
Okay, well, congratulations to Amy and to the Atlanta Council on, I think, a very rigorous and thought-provoking and excellent paper. And thank you very much, Shibley, for your comments. Also brought in lots of other dimensions. Thank you, everybody, for being here today.